post-apocalyptic fiction and, kind of an annoying portrayal of women and female friendship. And so I just wanted to write a book that had a different take on those things, and then really profound relationships between animals and humans. Yeah, I just think that's a deep connection that I feel and don't often see reflected in fiction. So yeah, between all of those things and kind of studying what I was studying and thinking about, okay, but how do we get this to people? And right around the time I was writing, Twilight was super popular. And truly millions of people were reading about Twilight and talking about it and arguing its merits. And I was like, okay, here's how we get into the pop culture psyche. And so, yeah, I wove as many issues and topics as I could into the books. And as my understanding deepened, and as I got older, I think more issues have been woven in by the third novel, because I started the first one when I was quite young. But they have been one of the great joys of my life to write. And I really try to impress that on people, that climate work can be joyful. I think people feel guilty feeling hope or feeling joy because it is a profound injustice. People are suffering now. People are dying now, largely folks of color. And it's hard to just kind of show up with hope or with joy. But I mean that more in the sense that, like, Adrienne Maree Brown talks about pleasure activism, that we'll do things more, we'll draw more people to us, we'll be better at what we do if we do it with pleasure and with joy. And so, yeah, I just always encourage folks to think about how their climate work might do that.
So is there another book?
So there are 3 in that series, Ava of the Gaia. And I did just finish another novel, but it's a separate series.
Excellent.
And kind of,
Can you talk about it, or is it too early?
It's a little early, but
okay, all right.
Always a theme.
We can do this again later.
Yeah.
Okay.
Soon.
That's awesome. Good for you. Congratulations. It's a lot of work. You're very busy.
I am, and I'm not. I do think grind culture is part of the problem, and being busy keeps us from being engaged citizens. So one of the reasons I actually really wanted to get my PhD is so that I would have time to do the work that I wanted. And so I don't work more than 9 to 5 on the weekdays, and I always schedule in a lot of time with people and outside, and try to really make sure that I'm taking care of myself and trying to stay as whole as possible, because then I can nourish other people more and not kind of lash out with grief, or, as we're having these conversations, really important ones about race and white folks' accountability. If I show up into a space kind of refreshed and not taxed, I can take that on. I can be confronted, I can be challenged, I can think, and I won't be as defensive because I've really charged my battery.
Yeah, you bring the best of you to that conversation.
Yeah, so I really try to work at a pace that I can sustain.
We're speaking with Grace Nosek, a PhD law student, author, podcaster, and director of UBC's Climate Hub. I'm curious, when you were putting together the UBC Climate Hub, were there any ahas? Were there any big moments of or revelations when you were putting that together?
I think there have been 2 for me that I will take to everything I go to. And the first, we didn't necessarily realize it immediately, but we've realized it in the 2 and 3 years since we started. But we started as this group called the Sustainability Collective, which was just all the different environmental groups at UBC coming together once a week to just do something, plan something. We had never before all come together. We didn't know each other. We were like grad students and undergrads from all across campus. And what I learned later from that is, because we didn't know what we were doing immediately, we just had to get to know each other. And we started to trust each other so deeply in the push, and really, really get to know each other as humans. And so each of us really has a different theory of change on climate. And a different maybe political take and even a political party that we would organize or campaign for. But because we deeply trust each other as humans and that we have the same vision for a future, that hasn't fractured us in the way that I've seen it fracture other groups. And so I've tried to bring that to lots of other things. Sometimes it's called track 2 diplomacy, that, you know, when you go into these formal rooms and these power structures, you inevitably like fall back into your same adversarial positions or whatever. But if you can kind of get into a place where you're actually like all having coffee or all at a barbecue, and then you're kind of humanized and the other person is humanized, it lead to breakthroughs that you might not always have. Of course, that's an oversimplification. There's a lot of privilege inherent in any of that happening, but just the ability to really take that time. Adrienne Maree Brown says to like move at the pace of trust, and I really like that. And then the second aha, the very cool thing that we knew but we didn't know completely is that we didn't need to advocate for a hub, right? We could have just taken one policy or something else. But as soon as we created essentially this entity, and UBC gets credit for this, right? Because we were knocking on all of these doors and we were asking for things, and big things, big systemic action on climate justice. We essentially asked for like just a continuing seat at the table instead of like a one-off policy or a different change by having this hub embedded within the university and the administration. And now what we're realizing just over and over again is just how much more we can push for once we have that seat at the table, and that everything now kind of comes through us and we're part of everything. And it's such a cool way to have young folks really in the room and shaping policy.
If people want to find out more about the Climate Hub, it's ubcclimatehub.ca.
Yeah. And there's a Facebook and some other social media and tons of stuff up on our website about our different programs or different projects.
I love these conversations, and I'm curious, as a podcaster, why you do it and what you've learned.
I started because I also love conversations. That's something that lights me up. And I think it's the skill I've actually practiced the most in life, is just talking to people and talking to a lot of different people. And what really got me to start the podcast is that people would send me climate videos or climate podcasts or climate stories. So like, Grace, you like climate, like this is your thing. I'm going to send them to you. And I hated them. I didn't want to read them. I'd scroll past them. I didn't want to watch the video. I didn't want to see the documentaries because I was like, this paralyzes me. This makes me feel totally unable to do anything. And paralyzing has a real consequence. As you alluded to earlier, you kind of stop and you don't do your organizing and you don't have that energy to get together. And I was like, man, if I'm not listening to these climate stories and watching these documentaries, like who is? Are we reaching the people who don't already care about climate change? Can that possibly be what we're doing in this moment? And we don't need climate deniers. We do not need climate deniers to take political action. In the US, every part of the country has at least 70% of people who believe in climate. And so we're there, but what we don't have, there's this big group in the middle who don't think it's an urgent threat and aren't sure what we should do about it and maybe don't think it impacts them. And so our job, in some ways, at least some of us, is to be telling stories to that group, because if we can get them to think about how urgent this is, what a justice issue it is, and that they are deeply implicated, that themselves, their children will all be affected by this, then we will have unbelievable political will for climate action. And so, yeah, I was like, I don't think some of these stories are getting to those people. And I wanted to kind of share how much joy I've gotten from leaning into climate, and that some of my best moments, my best friends have come from that space. So the conceit of the podcast is that I interview different people that I've met through the movement, and we kind of share a story of hope or joy.
I wanted to talk to you about pursuing a law degree or your PhD in law at UBC. We talked about your books. We've talked about the Potluck podcast. We talked about the UBC Climate Hub. Is there anything that we have not talked about that we should have talked about?
I mean, I guess what I would like to emphasize, if I haven't enough already, is that there's an incredible community working with me on this. Anything that I do is not just the product of me. And like, if I could show you the students working on this at the Hub, I think anyone listening, anyone watching would be inspired for days. It is young folks who are already dealing with so much at 19, at 20, taking on profound personal issues, profound global issues, and they are just on top of work and school and everything else. They're staying up till 2 a.m. Because of this visceral empathy for folks all across the globe. And that to me is the most unbelievable thing, the most nourishing. It gives me so much hope, and I feel like I have to, if they're going to be there doing that, like I have to keep doing what I'm doing. And so I would call out specific names, but I haven't gotten consent from folks, but the community is unbelievable, and we've grown from being nothing to, at the moment, we have 4 or 5 staff, we have tons of student staff, we have hundreds of volunteers. Our programming has reached tens and tens and tens of thousands. We've been giving workshops in high schools all over the region.
Yeah, I've been spending some time on your website. The programs are amazing. So kudos to you and the team for from starting from just an idea to such a wonderful project.
Yeah. One other thing I guess I'll point out from my PhD is just like, remember that any climate narrative you are imbibing has most likely been seeded by the fossil fuel industry. If it makes you feel bad or disempowered or like you can't do something, most likely that is somehow seeded by the fossil fuel industry. There's so much evidence that, for instance, like individual carbon footprints and this focus on personal responsibility is really a narrative that members of the fossil fuel industry have driven home. Because if it's your fault, then you're going to feel shame. You're going to distance yourself. You're going to try and say it's not a problem. You're not going to join up with other people. You're not going to see your collective power. And so in schools, there's curriculum connected to the fossil fuel industry in the US. I'm sure it's not the only country. Powerful money flowing into all of our elections, tons and tons of money. Just, I think, 1, to remember that, and 2, I think we need to hold the fossil fuel industry more accountable for this messaging, for how they've undermined, and for really stepping up to be a much, much bigger and actual part of the solution.
What's the toughest conversation you've had to have?
On climate change, I'm guessing.
Well, it could be in general. I mean, you talked a lot about building trust, and we do that in many different ways, but being vulnerable and open is certainly a good place to start. So I'm just curious, because it's the Conversation Lab, if you can shed any advice or comments or thoughts.
Yeah. One of the coolest things is this person who works at the Hub, has been working on our storytelling workshops for young people and for older people. And what I've learned from so powerfully is that we often feel like we have to present ourselves in our best light when we show up in a room. And, you can go in and you can be like, like the highlights of my CV, right? Like I went to law school, I interned in the White House, but I'm really starting to see and understand that actually, if you go in and do that, maybe folks will think that's what you have to do to make a difference. And in reality, everyone can make a difference all the time. And it looks so different. And for some people, that's just surviving. And survival is resistance. But has showed me how to present my vulnerabilities and the things that I'm scared of, and the hardest moments of my life, and the power of those, that students in high school can kind of see that and think, maybe see themselves in the movement. And I'm just like incredibly grateful